of the Holy Spirit, the preacher, the writer of Ecclesiastes, pens these words. Then I saw all toil and skill in work come from a man's envy of his neighbor. And this also is vanity and striving after the wind. The fool holds his hands and eats his own flesh. Better is a handful of quietness than 2 hands full of toil and a striving after the wind. I saw the vanity under the sun, one person who has no other, either a son or a brother, yet there is no end to all of his toil. And his eyes are never satisfied with riches, so that he never asks, well, for whom am I toiling and depriving myself of pleasure? This is also vanity and an unhappy business. Better are 2 than 1, because they have a good reward for their toil. For if they fall, one will lift up his fellow. But woe to him who is alone when he falls and has not another to lift him up. And again, if 2 lie together, they keep warm. But how can one keep warm alone? Then, though a man might prevail against one who is alone, 2 will withstand him. A threefold cord is not quickly broken. Better was a poor and wise youth than an old and foolish king, who no longer knew how to take advice. For he went from prison to the throne, though his own kingdom he had been poor. I saw all the living who move under the sun, along with that youth who was to stand in the king's place. There was no end to all the people, all of whom he led. Yet those who come later will not rejoice in him. Surely this is vanity and striving after the wind. Let's pray, and you may be seated. Lord, thank you for this day. Thanks for allowing us to come together once again and worship you. Lord, I want to pray right now for our time together in your word as the preacher switches gears a little bit. I pray right now that we're able to take the wisdom you have for us in this book and apply it to our lives. I pray right now that we see ultimately that these things are found in you. Lord, thank you, and I love you. In your name I pray, amen. Our title today is called Labors and Aspirations. Real quick, I wanted to try something. Let me try this. If you know these phrases, finish them with me, okay? Okay, here we go. A stitch in time saves 9. Very good. Let's try another one. Don't make me come back. There, yeah, absolutely. Parents of young kids, you know that one, right? That's really good. A penny saved is a penny. Okay. Here's one that some of us might know. Early is on time, and on time is late. Yes, very good. Awesome. So what those are examples of these short, pithy statements. They're called proverbs, right? A proverb is a pithy statement. I looked this up this morning. The word pithy means short and packed with truth. They're given to people to learn and remember and kind of like keep you and guide you as you go through your life. So, a stitch in time saves 9 is the idea is if you get to something sooner than later, you're going to have less work to do, right? Ben Franklin came up with that one. He also came up with the phrase or the proverb, the early bird gets the... Yeah, so if you get up early, you get a lot of worms, right? No, if you get up early, you're going to get more work done. What we're going to see in our text today is the preacher, he's kind of switching gears a little bit, and he hits up, a lot of people would say 4, I would say 4, although we did the 4th one last week. He hits us up with these proverbs, these general ideas in the midst of vanity is vanity, all is vanity, to show us what good life is, right? The big idea we're going to see in our text today between these 3 sort of disconnected proverbs is this. The good life comes, and by the way, Proverbs is about the good life, right? We don't do the things that the preacher did, and by not doing those things, we have a better chance of the good life. The good life comes from a proper perspective in life, okay? We're going to see 3 perspectives in life today, 3 things that affect all of us. The first one is this, it's work, it's our labors. The first thing we're going to see, the first perspective is work. It's a needed gift. It's something we need, and it's a gift from God. Secondly is friendship. Friendship is, much like work, it's a needed gift. Whether you admit it or not, you need friends, and friendship itself is a gift from God. Thirdly and finally is this, power is a need. No, it's not a needed gift. Power is temporary, right? He kind of pivots on the third one, and we're going to get into that. And we're going to see that if we take this perspective in these three areas of our life, when it comes to work and labor, when it comes to friendship, and when it comes to power, whether you're in power or submitting to power, these are three biblical ways to look at these that lead to a better life. Now, it's weird because usually I don't preach these kind of sermons, right? These sermons are, the sermons we preach, we follow the text. It's more about Jesus. And if you've been with us any time since like February, they're more, the sermon outlines are a lot more negative than this. But this is the word of the Lord. And the preacher is giving us good words to live by. So let's go ahead and dive in. First, we see that work is a needed gift. We kind of hinted at this in the opening, but when you look at Ecclesiastes chapter 4 as a whole, he covers four groups of people. He covers the oppressed, and we talked about that last week. Oppression is common, and we need to seek our justice above the sun, while we get it or not. But he talks about the oppressed. After that, he gets into this next set, and he talks about this thing that everybody deals with, and it's the idea of work, right? Unless you're a very select few group of people, you're not going to be getting out of life without working. And work is something that everybody can do on their own level, and I would argue everybody should be doing. But what happens is when you look at work, I think you have to take the right perspective. You have to look at it the right way. Some people look at work, well, let's go ahead and open up. He says this in verse 4, I see that all toil and all skill in work comes from a man's envy of his neighbor. I love this phrase because he's talking about, he's hyperbolating here. He's purposely overstating, but he goes, listen, all the innovations that you've seen, he said, comes from a man being jealous of his neighbor. And at first you're like, oh man, so this is the idea in the Ten Commandments where we're not supposed to covet our neighbor or a neighbor's stuff or a neighbor's wife. It's not quite that. Have you guys ever heard the phrase keeping up with the Joneses? Right? Okay, so this is really neat. I wanted to look up where it came from. Who here knows where the phrase keeping up with the Joneses came from? One person? Half a person? Okay, it actually came from a long-running comic strip that came out in 1930, and it went all the way until 1940. And it covers the foibles of, what are their names? The McGinnis family. And they're always striving to keep up with their neighbors, the Joneses. And what's really interesting is in the comic, when you read these comics, when you hear the preacher talk about reading these comics, during like the 27-year run that the comics were in, you never meet the Joneses. They're always off strip. And the setup of all the comics is look at what the Joneses got. They got a new lawnmower, we need a better lawnmower, right? They got a new house, we need a better house. And what the whole path takes is the Joneses go, they get envious, they put in the work, they get the thing, only for the Joneses off comic strip to get a better thing than what they landed with, right? I grew up watching The Simpsons. I'm not officially recommending that TV show, but you see that dynamic a lot in the early episodes of The Simpsons between the lead character Homer and one of the side characters, Ned Flanders. You know, Homer sees his neighbor get a nice pair of sneakers, so he has to have a nicer pair of sneakers, and then it blows up in Homer's face, right? That's the idea. And what happens is, a lot of times when we look, what drives us to get up out of our comfortable beds in the morning to go and work a job that we don't quite like or that we endure, that we hate, is we look over and we see our neighbors having something nicer than us. Have you guys ever had that thing where like you have a car, but then you look at other cars in the parking lot and suddenly it's not that nice of a car? Yeah, I am sure, I am absolutely sure that the reason I go through phones more than cars is because I get phone envy a lot. Some of us, we go through cars because we see our thing and then we look over either our neighbors or we see somebody flexing on social media and we're like, well, I need something better. And what he says is, I love this, he says, this is also vanity, or it's short-lived, and it's striving after the wind. I love that phrase, after the wind there, because no matter what you do, you're never going to have the best thing. New is only new for a year. That's it. You know, the hot, shiny new thing, whatever that hot, shiny new thing is, one, eventually, two, eventually, a shinier version of that. I bought a new to me car, and I was so excited because it was going to be the end of all my problems. And lo and behold, I've had it for about a year, and the new car smell's gone, and I kind of want a new one, right? The wrong perspective in life, one of them, when it comes to work, is working for the sake of keeping up or getting ahead of our neighbors. You go, okay, so the goal is to not work. You go to the other end. And, you know, the preacher says no. You go to verse 5, and he says, the fool holds his hands and eats his own flesh. Now, this is really interesting because it sounds morose, and it's not. Anytime the word fool is used in the Bible, particularly in the Old Testament, it's one of the few words that don't really have any redeeming qualities. Like if you ever read through the book of Proverbs, which also has several chapters written by most likely Solomon, you know, it talks about the ignorant and the simple. And think of, you know, the simple, you're like, oh, simple, they must mean stupid. What they mean is like a blank canvas, right? Like a blank chalkboard, right? No, when he talks about the fool, it's somebody who is foolish. It's somebody who goes against what wisdom is and fights against that wisdom. And what he says here, he goes, the fool, on the other hand, you know, rather than working, the fool, he folds his hands. What does that mean? He doesn't do anything. He relaxes, he rests, and then you're like, so he winds up eating himself? That's not what it means. It means self-consumption. It means eating yourself out of house and home. So what he's getting after here is the fool's lazy. The fool avoids work and thusly is lazy. You know, there's this whole proverb about this. It's Proverbs chapter 6, verses 6 through 11, where he talks about the fool, and he talks about the lazy person. He says this, go to the ant, O sluggard, consider her ways and be wise. Without having any chief officer or ruler, she prepares her bread in summer and gathers her food in harvest. How long will you lie there, O sluggard? When will you arise from sleep, a little slumber, a little folding of hands to rest, and poverty will come upon you like a robber. Right? And want like an armed man. You see, what happens is he goes and he kind of guards both ends of the rails, right? You don't work for the sake of beating out your neighbors, but the flip side is you don't work for the sake of you don't not work. There we go. And like, I want to be careful here because it's Family Sunday. Work itself is a good gift from God, and it's not just a gift, it's something that we as people are commanded to do. I don't want to paint with a broad brush, but it's important to make this point, all right? We live in a world, I think we talk about this once every couple of months, that have, you know, we have this trend in the world today, particularly in the United States, of NEETs, N-E-E-T-S. That's not in education, employment, or training, okay? And the idea is, depending on where you look, between 7 and 11% of people between the ages of 18 and 25 are NEETs, N-E-E-T-S, not in education, employment, or training, right? And like, that's not good for those people. You know, we're in this weird spot where, you know, a lot of times we have people who refuse to do any kind of self-embetterment, whether education or employment, which is clearly a gift from God that we'll get for a while, and they say, I don't need that, I have whoever's paying their bills. More often than not, their families, right? More often, you know, specifically, their parents or grandparents. You know, what will happen to most of those people is eventually their parents will pass on. You know, that's fun fact for Family Day, you know, their parents will pass on. I'm sorry. And those NEETs will not have the life skills to provide for themselves or pay bills, right? What that's a literal picture of is back in our text. The fool folds his hands and eats his flesh. Right? And you're like, Larry, you don't understand, the world's on fire. I shouldn't be working because the world's on fire. You know, there's this guy called Billy Joel who song called "We Didn't Start the Fire"? It was always burning. Help me finish the proverb. Since the world's been, we didn't start the fire. He wrote a sequel to it, actually, in some time of the. And you know what? He could have wrote a prequel to it back in the 1800s or the 1700s, right? So if we're supposed to work, but we're not supposed to work for our, to get ahead of our neighbors, what's the point of work? Why do we work then? That's a great question. Let's take a look at it, right? What we're going to see in all three of these proverbs is that God orders the world after his own character to glorify him, right? The reason work is good is because God himself is a worker. God is infinitely powerful. He's constrained by nothing save his own moral character. And God could have snapped his celestial fingers and created everything immediately overnight. But if you go to the first 2 chapters of Genesis, God doesn't choose to do that. What does he do? He takes 7 days. In 7 days, God, help me out, work. No, and God didn't rest for 7 days. Oh, I got the whole thing wrong. For 6 days, God what? He worked. And on the 7th day, he absolutely. And when you go throughout the Old Testament, you see this pattern that God sets for his people. I'm going through the Old Testament, and 3 or 4 times honoring the Sabbath. And God says, listen, honor the Sabbath, for 7 days God worked. And on the 7th, he rested. On 6 days he worked, on 7th he rested. You go all throughout the Bible, he's likened to a metal worker and a king and a vineyard dresser and a potter. God has jobs, and what happens is God created us as people to be like him, to have jobs. Right? You go, and one of the first things that we see over in Genesis chapter 2, verse 28, is it says, God blessed them, and he said, be fruitful and multiply, and fill the earth and subdue it. Have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the heavens, and over every living thing that moves on the earth. And what we see here is that this thing that God gives us, this drive, is to glorify him through work. And you're like, Larry, what kind of work? And that's the really good thing. For some of us who are younger, it's just working kind of a cruddy job, right? The McDonald's of the world, right? I remember having that job when I was 15 years old, right? And I learned what stress was because I was in the drive-thru during the Beanie Baby craze of whenever that was, right? And I got to tell you this, I hated going to work, but there was a sense of fulfillment that came along with a good day at work. That's a gift from the Lord. There's this other thing we see, and this is going to kind of transition us into the second point. It's in verse 8, there's this little phrase he says, one person who has no other, either son or brother, yet there is no end in all his toils, and his eyes are never satisfied with riches, so that he asks, for whom am I toiling and depriving myself of pleasure? This is also vanity and unhappy business. There's this idea that I know people who will not get a job because it's not fun, right? And I've had that conversation, and coming up from somebody who's had to work, I get kind of mad at that. And the answer is, well, it's not fun, so why do it? The answer is, a lot of times you work not for yourself or for your own personal fulfillment, though you can find fulfillment in your job. You ultimately find it in Jesus. You work for the sake of other people, right? We live in this time where it seems as though our existence is being, how do I say this well? Everything in our life is being taken away. All of our needs are being met, not by other people, family and friends like God intended, but rather a subscription service, okay? So I'll give an example, right? I don't need to have a friend. I don't need people to talk through my problems. I can just go to, right, for a low price of X amount of dollars a month, right? Or, I don't need to find relationships. I don't need romance. I can just subscribe to OnlyFans, right? Or I can subscribe to the romance novels that come out on Kindle Unlimited, right? That's a subscription, right? I don't need people to take care of me. I can pay for at-home health care. Against at-home health care, by the way, please hear me on that. We're not against therapy either. But there's this trend where our care has been removed from our kids, our parents, our friends, our family, our church, and now we just have a generic version of it without a face provided by people who don't care if we pay X amount of dollars a month. My friends, that's not what life is about. there's this tweet I saw, and it says, I just got done working so I could transfer wealth from my employer to my landlord, right? That's not the point of life, and that's not the point of work. The point of life is to glorify God through your work, and with your work, you do it not just for yourself, but for other members in your church family and friends. Which brings me to my second point. Work is a needed gift, and so is friendship. We go on to the next point, in the next little proverb, and the preacher says, two are better than one because they have a good reward for their toil. So I kind of want to pivot on this, right, on verse number 8, because in verse number 8, he makes this point, yeah, sometimes you work so hard, the rise and grind mindset that you forget who you're working for. But the other end is he makes this point that you can't be an island to yourself. You can't live that subscription life, right? The idea is if it's just you and nobody else, you're going to have a hollow and empty life, right? It's, lonely is the life that where you wake up, go across your studio apartment, log in, work, log out, have some DoorDash delivered, log back in, work till 5, log out, and then sit on your phone till 11 at night, only to do it again 6 days a week. That's not a fun way to live. Well, what do you need in addition to that? What do you need more than that? Well, he talks about it here. You need friends. Here's this really interesting thing. I read this in a commentary. So all throughout Proverbs, the preacher goes through every single topic you could think of. He talks about romance. He talks about family. He talks about power. He talks about friendship. And the only thing he doesn't say is vanity is friendship. Romance is havil, right? It's short. Friendship isn't. Power is havil. It's short. Friendship's not. We live in this time where there's a lot of talk of the male loneliness epidemic. There's a female loneliness epidemic as well. Friendship is the cure for that. Friendship is needed, and friendship is a gift. All right, let me talk about this for a minute. Here is, I want to build this real quick, the need for friendship. And I want to be clear here. When we say friends, we are talking about people outside of our immediate family. Why do you say that? Because I think a lot of times what we can do, and we tend to do this as the Bogans periodically, is we kind of build in on ourselves, and our whole world is our friend. Our whole world is our family. So I'm going to get my romance, I'm going to get my friendship, I'm going to get my discipleship, I'm going to get my everything from my community, which is my immediate family. It's the phrase, if you've heard it, us four, no more kind of thing. And that's not what the preacher is talking about here. He's talking about seeking out relationships outside of your immediate family group to build and have a community with. And you're like, how do you know? I'm so glad you asked. Over in the book of Proverbs, there's a lot of discussion about friendship, right? Over in Proverbs 17:17, it talks about a friend loves at all times and a brother is born for adversity, right? I don't know about you. Does anybody ever get into beefs with their siblings, right? A couple of us, 2 arms up, right? Man, my siblings like 1,300 miles away, and sometimes we get into it, right? I'll send the wrong emoji, right? Thumbs up emoji as a response to all texts is a bad move, I've learned, right? Proverbs 18:1, Proverbs 27:9. Oil and perfume make the heart glad, and the sweetness of a friend comes from earnest counsel, right? I love that. There's this other thing, and you're like, all right, yeah, friendship, I get it. There's this really beautiful friendship in the Old Testament that I think we could do well to model our lives after. It's these two men. It's David and Jonathan, right? A lot of people know about David. My kids are learning about David in Bible time in the mornings. I think they just got through the whole thing with David and Absalom, right? And what happens is a lot of people know about David, less people know about Jonathan. So let me catch you guys up. So David is the person that God chose to be a king after this wicked king Saul. And what happens is David, he's a shepherd. The Lord picks him. It's not on anything that David's connected with. It's completely the Lord picking him. And there's this really cool story where David, as a young man, gets selected to be the king by the Lord. And then the next chapter after, he fights this giant named Goliath. And his future father-in-law, Saul, before meeting David, says, nobody can fight this guy, so I will let him marry my daughter. Michael, and I'll give him half my kingdom, and he'll be the next in line to be king. So David shows up with a slingshot and kills Goliath, right? And what happens is David, after that battle, meets Saul's son, whose name is Jonathan. And there's this really cool verse when you get through it. It says, it's just kind of a throwaway verse, but after they meet, it says, as soon as he had finished speaking to Saul, the soul of to Saul, the soul of David, as his own soul. There's this connection between these two men that David and Jonathan have. And all throughout David's life, what happens is David and Jonathan are thick as. And the story of David, David gets crosswise with his wife, Michal, a couple of times. David's father-in-law, Saul, actually tries to kill David several times. You know, he is this foolish king that falls into sin, and God kicks him out of the throne. And between the time that he's kicked out and that he dies, which is a long time, he hunts down David. And Jonathan meet, and they'll get whatever the Hebrew version of coffee is, right? I don't know, what David makes, but I'm sure he brews it. Sorry, right? And they meet, and there's times where Jonathan goes and he saves David's life, and there's this scene where David and Jonathan know they're not going to see each other again, and they see each other and they weep, right? And you get to the end of Jonathan's life, and David outlives him, and there's this verse. It's in 2 Samuel 1, it says, David speaking of Jonathan, and he says, I am distressed for you, my brother Jonathan. Very pleasant have you been to me. Your love for me was extraordinary, surpassing the love of women. How the mighty have fallen, how the weapons of war have perished. When we're talking about biblical friendship here, right, we're talking about a type of bond that a man can have with a man and a woman can have with a woman that doesn't work between husband and wife. And we're in this really weird spot in culture because there's a decent chance, as we've been hearing this over the past 15 or 5 or so minutes, some of you may have thought they were gay, right? Maybe David and Jonathan were secretly romantically involved. In fact, back in the 70s, there was a whole movement trying to normalize that view of Scripture. And where we are as a society is we're so sexualized that we don't understand what friendship is. We're so sexualized that we think, well, they're that close, they must be being physical with each other. No. What we see here is what friendship is supposed to be in the Bible, right? What's really sad is when you look at how a lot of modern day culture defines friendship, it's not that. Right? I think of watching the show Friends in the 90s, and when the male characters would have emotional moments, they would quickly talk about sports to show that they weren't gay or sissy or whatever. No, friendship is a gift. I'll put it this way. I could say this. My wife and I are good friends. I would like to say that we're best friends. But she has a friend that I know of that she complains to about me because I can be a bit much. Usually between the hours of 6 a.m. and 10 p.m. Now, I think I'm a treat, and Deb needs to figure that out. But in reality, she has a friend that she can talk about things that she just can't talk about with her husband. Conversely, my wife's my best. But I have male friends that I can complain to about my wife. Now, here's the thing. But sometimes she can be a bit much, usually between the hours of 6 a.m. and 10 p.m. when she's awake, right? Y'all, that's okay. That's fine. You need your friends. You go back to this text, and he really digs into this because he looks at the utilitarian reason for friendship here. He goes, listen, man, if two are together and one of them falls, the other one will lift up his friend. It's easier to get pulled up when you're with somebody. But he says, but woe to him who's alone. Why? Because when he falls, he doesn't have another to lift him up. What's funny is you always think you can get up by yourself until you can't. I haven't had that life lesson yet. I'm well on my way. My stance has changed when I get up, so I know I'm on my way, right? He goes on and he goes, listen, again, if two lie together, they keep warm. Once again, this is a platonic thing. He's not talking about sexuality, but how can one keep warm alone? And you go, well, I can if I go to the store and buy enough clothing. That's not the point. Once again, we're not in the subscription model of humanity here. We don't buy things to meet our needs all the time. Man, we need other people. Thirdly, it says, man, and you know what? Though a man might prevail against one who is alone, two will stand him. A threefold cord is not quickly broken. And they're like, Larry, I get it. You know why? Because that's an attribute of God. You know what I love is when you think about the Trinity, the Father, Son, Holy Spirit, all co-equal with each other. They exist in unity and harmony, and you could even argue friendship. In fact, Jesus demonstrates his love for us by calling us his friends. Jesus says in John 15:15, no longer do I call you servants, for the servant does not know what his master is doing, but I've called you friends. For I have heard from my Father that I have made known to you. You did not choose me, but I chose you. I appointed you to go and bear fruit. That fruit should abide, so that whatever you ask the Father in my name, he may give it to you. I love that because with friendship, it's not a transactionary thing, right? I don't put time with my friends so they give me things. It's a totally natural and organic thing, which is a perfect picture of what salvation is, right? What I love about this is I don't get to talk about this often, or hardly ever because I don't watch it, and I'm going to regret it, but I'm so far into the sentence I'm going to commit. There are shows in the world that usually are not American, and they're cartoons. They're usually out of Japan, right? They're called anime. Yeah, right? And being a bus driver, I hear about this anime. I say Japanimation to annoy the middle schoolers a lot, right? And by the way, if you have like a young person who says anime, call it Japanimation, and they'll get really mad. It's fun, right? And what happens is they tell me all these plots about whatever, and there's this constant plot, and it's right? There's this very common trope in a lot of fantasy, and a lot of anime, and a lot of just cartoons and a lot of shows where a group of people who don't know each other come together and they become friends, and through their friendship they're able to overcome tremendous odds, right? That's why we need friendship, right? I would hate to live the kind of life to where I need to be picked up, but my bank account's low, so I can't pay my subscription. I would hate to live the kind of life where I don't need anybody until I do, but nobody's there for me because I didn't need them in the first place. I would hate to live the kind of life with my Creator, Jesus, who calls me his friend, where I view it as transactional. And I've had a bad week and I've sinned greatly and I don't feel like I deserve whatever grace and riches he wants to give me. No, we look at friendship as a good gift from God because friendship is something that God gives to us with him, his son, friends. So what do we do with this? Make friends and keep friends. So first we see, right, work is a needed gift. Secondly, we see secondly, we see friendship is a needed gift. Thirdly, we see this, power is temporary. Could you say that power is a gift? Yes. Could you say that power is needed? Also yes. But that's not how he covers it here. He does this really interesting thing. So he goes on and he tells a little bit of an allegory. He expands the proverb out to tell a very short story, and he tells the hero's journey, right? It's the hero's journey is a popular literary trope. What happens is it starts with somebody who's a nobody. They go through some character developing things, and then they become a hero. A really good example of this is Frodo in Lord of the Rings, right? Starts out as a hobbit in some place that I always forget. I think Bag End, and he saves the world. Hero's journey, right? And we see that, and the hero's journey is the opener. You go to verse 13, it says, better was a poor and wise youth than an old and foolish king who no longer knew how to take advice. So the setup was there's this poor young man who was very wise, and he knew how to run things, and he was in prison. We'll get into that in a minute. And there's this foolish old king who was off of his rocker crazy and didn't know how to take advice, right? Now, we've seen this in this is like most YA novels and movies, right? The young person coming, rising to power, replacing the foolish patriarch or the foolish king, right? And that's exactly what happens. Verse 14, he went from prison to the throne, though in his own kingdom he had been born poor. So what happens is we see this thing where this kid, this poor kid, has this hero's journey, and he takes over the kingdom in a good way. It's great. He's rolling. And when we see the movies, this is where the movie ends, isn't it? Yeah, right? You bow to no one, and 30 minutes of a montage of stuff, and that's the end, right? But what happens is the preacher here does this really smart thing because he continues after. He follows the happily ever after, right? He sees what happens after the credit rolls, and he says, excuse me, there was no end to all the people, all of whom he lived, or all of whom he led. So what happens is he continues on, and the people who knew the young man from poor to king, they were there, but a lot of other people came in as well. People who didn't know his story. People who didn't know where he came from. People who didn't know his character. He just knew him as the de facto guy in charge. Now, it says here, there's no end, yet those who came after him will not rejoice in him. I think that's translated kind of weird. I really like it was done in the NIV. It says, but those who came later were not pleased with him as a successor. So the point they're making is this guy is a king so long that the new people who came in didn't think he was a good king. You can make the argument that they thought he was unwise and foolish and didn't take advice. They didn't rejoice in him. So what this young man finds himself is he doesn't die the hero. No, he lives. But he lives long enough to become the villain. You guys ever hear that phrase? You either die the hero, live long enough to become the villain. That's what happens to this young man with his power. You see, what happens with power is a lot of times it's held on to probably too long, and you go from being the good upstart revolutionary to the gross guy who probably forced himself on people, right? You go from being the victor to the oppressor. And what happens is when we press after power, while it is a gift and power is ordained, and you can see that over in Romans 13, no power is ordained but ordained by God. Ultimately, whatever power we have, it doesn't last forever. It's temporary, right? There's this song I like a lot, stuff for my illustrations, and I'm liking it. There's this song by Coldplay called Viva La Vida. Anybody? No. More than 3 people. Oh, 4. All right. So it's a really interesting song. It was came out on the same album by Coldplay, Viva La Vida, back in 2006. And what's really interesting is it's really jaunty and fun, and it like talks about like it's from the perspective of a king, right? And it talks about this whole thing that the preacher's getting after. The first verse is, I used to roll the dice, I used to feel the fear in my enemy's eyes, listen to the crowd would sing, now the old king is dead, long live the king. One minute I held the key, but next the walls were closed on me, and I discovered my castle stand upon pillars of sand, right? And you go through the song, and you get to the very end of the song, and the last verse goes like this. It was a wicked and wild wind, blew down the doors, let me in, shattered windows, and the sound of drums. People couldn't believe what I had become. The revolutionaries wait for my head on a silver plate. I'm just a puppet on a lonely string. Who would ever want to be king? You see, what's really important to understand when we talk about power, social, political, familial, work power, is it doesn't last. And if we try and hold it more than what the Lord's got for us, more often than not, it doesn't end well for us. You know, what's really interesting about that song is that Chris Martin wrote that as an homage to King Louis XVI, I believe, as he was beheaded. So there's this story that Louis XVI, one of the becoming last monarchs in France before the French Revolution, as the crowd went to decapitate him, he tried to give them one last speech to make right with the French people that he led wrong. And they didn't want to hear. And his power was removed when they removed his head, right? And he had a speech planned and nobody wanted to hear it. So what do we do with our power? Man, I got to tell you something. 'Cause given away. You know, what's really interesting is when we look at our life today as Christians, we as Christians don't have power in and of ourselves. Our power as Christians doesn't come from the fact that we're Christians or even that we're a large voting bloc. Where it comes from is our power comes from Jesus Christ. What I love is the fact that it's not even our power to begin with, right? And the mistake we make is when we think that Jesus Christ and the power that he has that's in our lives doesn't come from Jesus, but it comes from our own goodness. Y'all, if you have any kind of power or authority, it's not yours, it's the Lord's. And you don't own it, you steward it for the good of others. Right? That's what sets a good leader apart from a weak one. So what do we do with this text? Great question. I think a couple of things. One is this. We need to realize that any gift that we have, work, friendship, or authority and power, is a gift that comes from God. And we need to glorify God with that. You know, I was thinking about this. I as a bus driver and I as a dad and I as a pastor have been given authority in various realms, church, bus, and family. And authority isn't mine to show that I'm the top dog. In 2/3 of those realms, I'm not anyways. It's to bring life. It's to embetter the life of our church, my kids, and the kids on my bus. Right? What are you doing with your power? Pardon me, what are you doing with the gifts that God given you? Secondly, what's really important is when we look at these gifts, they're a reflection of God's goodness. So not only should we look at it something to be stewarded as, but also we need to look to the giver of the gift. You know, the gift is never better than the giver. I remember when my mom and dad got divorced when I was like 8. That was not a fun time, but there was a time I looked forward to a lot. It was Christmas time because I would get a lot of really cool gifts, right? Something that's sad, though, is, you know, very shortly after my parents' divorce, there was a restraining order put on my dad, and while I had all the cool gifts from my dad, I didn't have my dad. And I would have happily traded all the gifts I got from my dad for more time with him, right? The gifts that God gives you aren't better than God himself. So we should pivot and look to our relationship with our Heavenly Father, the wonderful gift giver. Thirdly and finally, what do we do with this text? What's really cool about this text is it's written in a way, you know, if a Christian follows these, they're going to have a good life. If a non-believer follows these, they're going to have a good life. It's good to have a proper perspective on work. It's good to have a proper perspective on friendship. It's good to have a proper perspective on power. I think we'd agree with that, right? However, true satisfaction, true happiness, and true fullness doesn't come from just enjoying the gifts that the Lord gives. It comes from knowing the Lord. If you're not a Christian today, consider giving your life to Jesus. Why? Because not only did he give friendship and work and the concept of power for our, you know, Jesus gave himself a ransom for many. Well, who's many? Anybody? Let's pray. Lord, thank you so much for this day. Thank you so much for letting us come together and worship you. Yeah, I thank you for those things. I pray right now, Lord, for those of us who view work higher than we ought to, that we lower it. Those of us who view work lower than we ought to, that we raise it. Pray right now that us relationships, Lord, in and out of our family. And Lord, I pray right now that we see the true giver of power, you. I pray right now that we seek you in that. Pray right now for anybody here who's not a believer, God, that you bring them to come to know you as Lord and Savior. Please be with us as we worship you and take your table. Thanks and I love you. In your name I pray.